Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Keely Linton, and I'm with Strong Hearted Native Women's Coalition, and we're hosting this webinar series. Today, we're welcoming Cibonay Jimenez, and I'll introduce her in just a minute. Just a couple instructions for the chat options. Our chat and our question section doesn't always work so that everyone can see. So if you have a chat or question, you can enter that in, and we will copy and paste so that everyone can see that or answer your question. The best mode is to probably put any questions in the question tab instead of the chat. We are also recording this session, and we will give you some time at the end of the presentation, and we will stop recording so that you can ask any questions that you'd like to off the recording. We also have a couple videos that we're going to be showing that you're going to have to click on yourself in order to view. Unfortunately, our audio video option again is having some technical issues. So we posted the first video that we're going to be showing in the chat tab that you can click on the link, and Cibonay will prompt you when it's time to click on that link. If you have any difficulties, you can chat with us and we'll see if we can help you get that up. But hopefully that'll work. And if not, we'll work with it as we go along. So I'd like to welcome Cibonay Jimenez. She is a good friend of ours here at Strong Hearted. We've worked with her several times. I'm happy to have her join us today. She has 20 years professional experience working in public health, education, domestic violence, sexual assault, sex trafficking, mental health, social services, healthcare, substance abuse, social justice. She also worked part-time for the state coalition, the California Domestic Violence. She's worked as a chief program officer at Weave. She's got a variety of experiences, and I'm happy to have her here. So thank you, Cibonay, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Keely, for the introduction. And I want to just thank all of the Strong Hearted Native Women Coalition staff for coordinating this, not only the series, but for all of the work that you do. I'm super honored to have been asked to be a part of this and share a little bit with you today. And so, yeah, as Keely mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about sexual assault in Native communities. And I wanted to acknowledge that this is a really large topic, and we could spend days and weeks on this. But so this is kind of going to be a brief overview, and you know, afterwards, if there are more questions or interests, please reach out to me. Before I get started with the actual presentation, I wanted to take a moment to just kind of acknowledge the land. As a Native person, you know, it is very important to me to acknowledge the original caretakers, and I know that, you know, in person we typically do this as kind of an opening, but we can still do it virtually. And so I want to, you know, most of us are in California. I think I'm calling or videoing in from Sacramento, California, and my tribal peoples are from, you know, Arizona and Mexico. And so as a Native woman, I'm Yaqui and Casanwamades and also Chicana. And so I want to acknowledge those dual identities as well. But I also want to acknowledge the land, the California land of all of the Indigenous people that were the original caretakers and continue to be. So I thank them for allowing me to be here on this land and to be able to enjoy it and assist with the caretaking of it. So I wanted to kind of, again, just, you know, take a moment to acknowledge that. As Keely mentioned, you know, I did throw some webinar objectives in here, but really just simple, very straightforward in terms of just, you know, providing an overview of sexual assault, kind of some history of sexual assault response teams, as well as some of the impacts on Native communities. And then, you know, we can talk about some resources and tools as well. I had wanted to share a personal digital story of myself, and this is something that is new to me. I've had personal digital stories, for years now, but I usually haven't really shared them publicly. Over the last couple of years, I've kind of, with some mentorship from some women that I respect deeply, is that, sharing my story is actually relative and impactful for those that I'm working with, especially when I'm talking about violence against Native women. So I'm not going to be able to show it just because this is not a YouTube link, and so with the audio issues. But I did want to kind of just pull out and highlight a couple of things that I wanted to mention about that personal story. And one of them is that I'm speaking to you all and doing this work as a survivor of not only sexual assault, but also domestic violence, as witnessing domestic violence as a child, and then also experience it with my own personal relationship in the past. And so, that is, in this world today, a lot of times we are asked to kind of compartmentalize or isolate our own personal experiences or our identities or, different roles that we may play. And I'm a strong believer that only leads to further disconnection. And so I believe that it's really important that we acknowledge our different roles and our experiences. And so I am here speaking as a survivor, and I'm also, a mom, and I'm a Native woman, and I don't separate that from the day-to-day work that I do, regardless of whether I'm working with tribal people, the Native community specifically, or with mainstream projects. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. I also wanted to name a couple of things. And, part of this is because our work, and when we're talking about sexual assault and violence against Native women or Native peoples in general, it is very intersectional with everything, including education, including environment, including two very relevant things that are going on in the world today. And one of those is, of course, COVID-19. And, as a result of COVID-19, we are switching this to a virtual platform. And so COVID-19 has definitely impacted survivors of sexual assault and the work that we are doing in that area and in that field. So I wanted to acknowledge that, as well as when you're looking at Native communities and you look at COVID and how it has impacted Native communities disproportionately, right? I have a couple of contracts where I'm working with tribes nationally, so across the United States, and a lot of the rural tribes, and kind of working on COVID response, and they've been impacted disproportionately. So again, acknowledging that, and as we do this work within sexual assault and violence against Native peoples, we have to keep that in mind. And it's been re-traumatizing for Native peoples as well, when we look at the history of pandemics and, and so forth. And then the other thing that, is very much connected is, how our continued fight against racism. And when we're looking at this, and there is a very clear connection between these and sexual assault. There's a very clear connection between these, sexual assault, and the prevalence and impact on Native communities. And so, right now we're talking about, today we're talking about sexual assault within Native communities, but, we're looking at a lot of the symptoms, and it's time that we take a look at those root problems and with regards to a means to continued healing. So again, I don't want to, spend a whole lot of time on this, but I also, again, want to acknowledge that it is very relevant, and we are collectively experiencing these things as we do our sexual assault work. Okay, so this is the first video I wanted to show, and so you have the link in the chat. I want to it's about 3.5 minutes long, so I'm going to take about 4 minutes and mute myself so that you can all watch this video on your own, and then we will resume and talk briefly about it.
Cibonay, some of the people are having some issues clicking the link. So for everyone, we did post the link in the questions box as well.
Okay,
And
I will, yeah, it's in the question and answer box. I'll give people, are most people able to pull it up, or should I just resume without it?
no, let's give them a few more minutes and see.
Okay, so I'll give you guys a few extra minutes because I know some of you are just clicking on it. Okay. I know that it looks like there are a couple of other messages saying that there's still a couple of people having trouble opening the video, but I do want to, I forgot to mention that I will be sending the links to these with the PowerPoint. You'll receive them, I believe, next week. Linda afterwards can kind of explain that process, but you will get the links. So I'm going to just kind of reference a little bit about the video clip. And I'll do the same for the others. It's not super imperative that you've seen the link, or seen the video at this exact moment, but I will send the links along with the materials so that you can watch them later, and you can also utilize them as tools while you're working with your community or families or survivors. So again, this video clip is actually an animated vignette that was created by Sakui. Sakui is the California Consortium for Urban Indian Health. In the past, I have worked with Sakui as a consultant on their Red Woman Rising project, and, you know, addressing and working with Native communities, specifically with violence against women. And so this was actually created as, you know, a digital tool to, you know, for organizations, for tribal peoples, for advocates to utilize. And so we've shown this actually in, you know, with youth groups, we've showed this with staff, and I've actually showed it with, you know, TV support group participants, clients. It talks about kind of like the historical framework in terms of, you know, with contact and colonization and all of that, right, in terms of oppression and kind of setting up how historically violence against women was, you know, kind of created and how it's continued to be perpetuated. So again, this is a great tool to open up a discussion, to talk about these with not only clients, but your community. And so again, you know, that was just kind of to make that connection. And when we're looking at interconnectedness and intersectionality, you know, I wanted to keep in mind not only, you know, when we talk about anti-racism and we talk about, you know, those things, you know, we have to keep in mind that a lot of the symptoms that we are working very hard to work ourselves out of our jobs, a lot of them are systemic and they're, you know, rooted very deeply into our history. Moving along, I wanted to kind of also share, you know, two of these centering principles. I was a part of the Network Weaving Learning Lab, which was funded by Blue Shield a couple of years ago. And those of us that participated, we created a kind of a card deck with principles and poems and different things, you know, to keep in mind, and tools as we're doing this anti-racism work and working within social justice. And so again, these two cards again reiterate you know, oppression and the connection between oppression and liberation, as well as systems, right? And so it's really important that, you know, as we're doing this work, we remember that in order to actually continue that healing process, we do have to look into the history of things as well as root causes. Okay, so looking at you know, kind of a general overview of sexual assault, I'm going to read a couple of these. Some of the information on slides throughout this presentation, I'm not going to read every little piece. You will have the slides and you can read through them fully later. I added, you know, some extra content just so that you can have it to read, but I'm going to focus just on a couple of things. So for overview of sexual assault, again, you know, sexual assault is experienced as a physical or psychological and psychological traumatic intrusion to the body and spirit of a person. And I think this is important, you know, when we're saying to the body and spirit of a person, because historically, when, you know, you look at definitions of sexual assault, it doesn't acknowledge anything beyond the physical experience. And so as Native peoples, we know that it is important that, you know, when something is happening to us physically, we are also experiencing distraught and unbalanced emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, and all of that. So again, this is really important that, you know, now in the field today, we are in fact working in this way and interpreting it that way. Sometimes survivors are exposed to a near-death experience, both in reality and in perception. So again, as advocates or sexual assault advocates, it is really important that a lot of times survivors' experience are minimized, and whether or not we believe that in reality their life was threatened or near death, that is irrelevant. We want to make sure that we're acknowledging that it was a near-death experience for that survivor, regardless of what we think. And so, because of the traumatic impact of sexual assault, that is detrimental to, you know, believing a survivor. You know, again, sexual assault or, you know, violence against Native women, it's an experience of loss of control. And so when we're working with survivors, it is really important for us to aid in regaining control, right? For that survivor to regain control of what they can. And then, kind of looking at moving from victim to survivor, it is important that we understand that, victims can in fact move forward with healing, and this doesn't have to necessarily become a life-defining event. So I wanted to kind of just, again, an overview. We oftentimes use sexual assault or sexual violence as kind of umbrella terms. And, in this next slide, there are some different types of sexual violence. I know that it is sometimes in these shorter presentations to kind of, talk again using the umbrella term, so I want to acknowledge that. But there are very specific types of sexual violence, and there are others that I'm not putting on this slide as well, so I don't want to minimize that. Ones that I have put on the slide include sexual assault, include child sexual abuse, sexual assault of men and boys, intimate partner sexual violence. For a very, very long time, rape by a spouse was not necessarily acknowledged as sexual assault or sexual violence. And within the last several years, there's been a lot of advocacy in terms of changing penal codes and changing, different descriptions and definitions so that that is included, right? Other types include incest and drug-facilitated sexual assault. So again, this is not an all-inclusive list. There are others. Okay, so I wanted to kind of move into giving some statistical overview. I also want to acknowledge that statistics is, it's a beautiful thing because it gives us information. It gives us some, not only quantitative, but when we do surveying and sometimes we hear stories, we get that qualitative narrative as well. But also I want to acknowledge that, there are obviously some flaws with statistics and some challenges. And, one of those challenges is that we know a lot of these statistics are lower than what we actually see in our communities as a result of underreporting, right? We also know that there has been very little historically focused on or gaining information and statistics for Native communities specifically, right? And so again, there's been a lot of advocacy and push for more resources and funding so that we can get this information so that we can better serve and we can find those gaps, right? But I do want to kind of go over some statistics that we do have in terms of what has guided the work so far, and kind of, again, looking at what we know is happening in our communities and kind of working from there. So here I've inserted, a piece of a report from, the CDC. And here, a couple of them, again, I'm going to just pull out a couple of bullets, looking at more than half of Native women have experienced sexual violence, right? The very, top bolded narrative says that more than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaskan Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. So that includes any, violence. So you're looking at almost 85% of Native women. And then the bottom pieces of that are kind of broken down with different types of violence. But when you're looking at stalking, again, 50% of Native women. When you're looking at victims of sexual violence, and looking at non-Native perpetrators, you've seen a very high percentage, right? And so a lot of this information helps guide some of the early work that we've done, but then also looking at where we can kind of move forward. And then, the other thing I wanted to point out with this particular report is that it emphasizes that there is a much higher need for medical care for Native women who experience violence, right? And specifically sexual and domestic violence. We're looking at, again, well over 50%, of women that have expressed concern for their safety. When you look at the brutality and the extent of physical damage and physical trauma, it is higher for Native women than other races. This statistic is pulled from CCUI, again, the California Consortium for Urban Indian Health, and the first little black blocked out screen is the same information, just kind of in a GIF or GIF. I might not be saying that right, but and so because of the audio, where I'm not going to play it, but really the infographic explains the same exact information. So this is focused on urban Native data, and here it says that 65% of urban Indian women have experienced interpersonal violence, right? And then it gives a breakdown of those same women, and again, 48% experience sexual assault, right? And looking at the high rate of child physical abuse, as well as domestic violence. So again, looking at the connection between the different types of violence, as well as the violence and trauma that we've experienced throughout our lifetime. The third slide on statistics is again from Sakui, and it focuses on again some information with regards to sexual assault. Here it says that 1 in 3 Native women will be sexually assaulted in her lifetime. 86% of these assaults are committed by non-Native perpetrators. So again, this statistic is 86%. The first slide that I showed was in the 90s. Again, we're looking at who is doing this harm and who are they doing it to. The second infographic on the slide states that being physically or sexually abused makes teen girls 6 times more likely to become pregnant and twice as likely to get an STI. So we're looking at the connection between reproductive justice and reproductive health with regards to being a victim or survivor of sexual violence. And this is important because a lot of times when we're doing crisis response, a lot of times we see gaps in follow-up in additional areas such as STI screening and treatment and follow-up case management. This is taken from another data source, and it looks at kind of, again, sexual violence against women across a lifetime. So we're looking at an increase in definitely any sexual violence, but then it's also broken down by penetration, and then other things such as sexual coercion, and things like that. And that's important because I know that when we look at previous data from when I started my work in this field and other fields, a lot of times there was limited data with regards to what sexual assault experiences, right? So there was rape, and then there was no experience with sexual violence or sexual assault. And so now we are getting a little bit more information about the different types and how women are experiencing that throughout their lifetime and the impacts of that. So we're looking at not only the trauma of an incident, but we're looking at compound trauma. We're looking at trauma across that lifetime, and also keeping in mind that historical and intergenerational trauma as well. I wanted to throw in a slide in here for some statistics on sex trafficking. Again, for those of us who do sexual violence work, sex trafficking is very relevant. With regards, this is taken from the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women, and here it's very clear that this is an issue in our communities. When you're looking at 40% of individuals involved in sex trafficking as being identified as American Indian, that's huge, right? Especially when you're looking at our percentage with in general with all races, right? And so there's obviously a disproportionate problem, and that's why we are talking about this. That's why we are continuing to provide advocacy for this. And then when you're looking at the connection between those that have been in foster care, those who have experienced child abuse, and all of that, it becomes really relevant. And again, as we look at root problems, root causes, this is important information. And then, the bottom statistics that says 79% of Native victims reported being sexually abused as children, right? Again, so we're looking at abuse across a lifetime and kind of like those impacts, later in life. I also wanted to add, this slide on missing and murdered Indigenous women. There has been a lot of wonderful work in this area in California specifically. And I know that, this is an earlier report from the Urban Indian Health Institute, from a couple of years ago, and it was really in response to a lack of accurate data from mainstream governmental reports and surveys that really wasn't giving, I don't want to say credit because that's not necessarily what it is, but giving, having a true picture of the impact of this problem within Native communities. So since this report, like I said, there are a number of organizations and communities and tribes that are really working on missing and murdered Indigenous women in terms of policy and advocacy and collecting data and doing very, very intense direct service work, right, and intervention. But again, so just acknowledging that, that is another big issue that we are tackling in our communities. So looking again, I mentioned that there are obviously problems with data, and a lot of that is a result of barriers to reporting. So this slide kind of focuses on some of those barriers. It's important to acknowledge that reporting sexual abuse is a personal decision and it's not always easy. So again, as advocates, when we're working in this field, it sometimes is difficult because we may feel that there's a need to report, or we may feel that, it should be reported. However, that's not necessarily our personal decision. And of course, that doesn't mean that our organizations don't have policies against reporting child abuse or things like that. But again, our job is to empower and provide information and resources so that survivors can make informed decisions, right? And feel in control of making those decisions for themselves. And then the flip side of that is obviously that, we have underreporting. And, a lot of times reasons for that include what's, bulleted here, including feelings of shame, guilt, and embarrassment, feelings of negative consequences, as a result of reporting, whether that is retaliation or just kind of, the view of somebody may change. There might be a financial dependence, right, on the person doing harm. And this is important because, again, each of these bullets are much deeper than just kind of, if we just take it literally in what it states. Financial dependence can look, like obviously that they are reliant on, that monthly income to survive, or it may mean, that reporting means that someone may have to take extensive time off of work for law enforcement interviews, for court dates and all of that, and maybe they cannot financially do that. So again, looking at that financial piece goes beyond just, direct dependence from the person doing harm. Other times it is a matter of not wanting other people to know, right? Not wanting either family or not having a place to disclose within your community, especially in smaller tribal communities in rural areas, or even in urban areas where, where we have urban Indian health centers, for example, or something. A lot of times we are either related to people who work there, or we know people who work there very closely, or someone who is related or knows the person who did harm works there. And again, there's a lot of different dynamics that create barriers for Native communities, both in rural and urban areas. There may be a lack of resources, right? And then there might be distrust between not only the criminal justice system, but medical system, right? If you look historically at the experience between Native peoples and these two very large systems, and also child welfare, and you're looking at, other mainstream systems, it wasn't necessarily always positive, right? I remember my grandparents referred to, hospitals as places where people die. And so with those stories and that trauma associated with previous experiences, sometimes that does become a barrier to actually reporting and moving forward with that. And then, of course, cultural and language barriers, right? In my personal digital story that I would have shown, I talk about getting inadequate treatment as a young child and as a teenager in different incidents because, my therapist couldn't understand what I was talking about when I talked about my coming of age ceremony. They couldn't understand that very intricate cultural and spiritual system that I had been raised and grown up with, right? So, those things are very real, and a lot of times, and in my specific case, it caused me to shut down and not seek that type of treatment for many, many, many years. This slide kind of just goes over some of the effects of sexual assault and looking at sexual violence and trauma impacts. And here I wanted to really emphasize that, every person is going to experience sexual violence or, any incident very differently, right? The same incident could happen to two people, and their experience and their treatment and healing, it needs to look very differently. And so keeping in mind that while at the same time advocates and programs need to have policies and procedures and kind of, that in place, at the same time, this work is very much case by case. And that means that it's important for us to understand those trauma impacts, right? And to understand that the experience of trauma here specifically with sexual violence, it's experienced and healed with regards to our own worldview, our own experience, right? And so when you're looking at the complex whole, all of the things that make up who we are, all of the past experiences that we've had, including intergenerational and historical trauma, including any past trauma, regardless of whether it's sexual violence or other types of trauma, they all impact how we respond to other things in our life, right? As well as our resiliency factors, right? And so, our coping strategies and all of those different things are very much interconnected. Therefore, our crisis response and our healing response needs to kind of reflect that understanding. Okay, so I'm gonna, this is a video. I'm gonna try this, and if we get too much feedback saying that the video didn't work, I'm going to, the next video, I won't try to post the link, but I want to try it one more time. This video is I just posted it to Linda. So Linda, if you can share that. For some reason, I can't share to everybody. So Linda is taking the lead for me on that. And I'm going to give, so it's 6 minutes. I'm going to give you guys 7 minutes to watch that on your own. I'm going to mute myself. In the chat, if you're having trouble for some reason pulling that up, if I hear enough people saying they're having trouble, then I'll just kind of intervene earlier. And again, you will get the link to this though, so don't worry, you'll be able to watch it later. Okay, so Linda's posted it in the chat. I'm going to mute myself and we'll start back up in about 7 minutes. Okay, so that should have been enough time for you all to watch that video. Again, it looks like maybe one person was having trouble pulling that up. If there were others, again, you'll get that link and you can watch it at a later time. But really, this video clip just kind of shared a story of, of a survivor and, kind of Native women speaking out, not only of the problem within their communities, but also the trauma and the healing, that needs to happen with regards to sexual violence. So again, I think that this is a great example of a story. Sometimes we can use media. I personally feel like, some of these tools are an extension of our traditional orality, right? Storytelling, and, it's not only important for survivors healing and moving towards healing, but also it's a way that as Native peoples, we have historically and always kind of connected through story, right? And so I think that these are, the video clips, not only is it, nice to include in a presentation, but also they are very much tools that you can use within your communities and, even survivors. Okay, so when you're looking at, rights, again, what do we, as advocates, what is our role? Like, what are we here for, right? And one of the things that is very much within our scope and something that we have to be accountable for is ensuring that the rights of sexual assault victims are upheld, right? And so these are some of the rights that, we acknowledge, and these are, universal rights that, are embedded in most START goals, as well as, within, when you're looking at with, different policies or laws, when you look at VAWA and things like that, right? So, obviously, again, we already talked a little bit about, the survivor having the right to be believed, right? And this is a challenging one sometimes because, in the field, there sometimes is a lot of pushback in terms of, what if they're lying, or, what if it didn't happen that way? And then, look at, the instances of sexual assault and sexual violence, very, 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 very rarely is somebody ever making this up, right? And regardless of, the lack of reporting or the low reporting, when we talk to survivors, a lot of times that barrier of reporting and, the significant and huge amount of shame and stigma and all of that that goes along with it. When somebody speaks up, it is our job to believe them and to kind of help them through that process. It's also their right to feel safe and supported. They have that right to healing. And, part of that right, involves as advocates and responders to not do additional harm, right? And so that is why we have to be, trauma informed, culturally relevant, and all of that. And sometimes that is difficult within our Native communities because our communities and tribes are so diverse, and not only culturally, linguistically, depending on where we're at. And, with mainstream organizations, a lot of times Native people kind of get clumped together, and that huge diversity is not necessarily acknowledged, right? And so we can't assume that all Native people need the same thing, that not all Native people have the same ways. And so again, acknowledging that and realizing that, especially when we're working with mainstream organizations, but also there are a lot of areas, especially in California, where, we have very large urban communities. We have a lot of Native people from all over the hemisphere. And so kind of keeping that in mind that, that diversity needs to take priority also, so that we don't do further harm. For survivors, they have the right to feel a sense of justice, right? And this is an interesting one also because justice that looks very differently for every person. And again, focusing on what that sense of justice looks like for that victim. For some, that means, the criminal system, right? And for others, that means, a more restorative, system. and kind of focusing on rebalancing, that harm within their community. And so I know that California tribes are working very much on this issue and kind of in the tribal courts. They're doing a lot of different types of programs, and so I do see restorative justice and focusing and working with people that do harm, again, looking at root causes so that these things are not continued intergenerationally. But for some survivors, it also does mean, using the criminal justice system. And so we kind of have to have that conversation with them and not necessarily assume that we know what justice should be for that incident. Again, looking at, they have the right to feel re-empowered, right? And to get that control back and, to be able to make those choices on their own. They have the right to have options and good information. So again, as advocates and responders, it is our job to give them that good information, to be able to explain what the options are. And, I know a lot of times this is very confusing. I tell people that when I, some years ago, when I was going through my own domestic violence court issues and custody issues, that stuff was confusing. That was probably one of the most difficult things that I've done in terms of court systems. And I have a master's degree and I can read, and I work within those systems. So I have some understanding, and it was still very difficult, right? Not only because of the emotional and psychological and all of those pieces as a survivor, but then also because the system is complicated and the system has not made it easy for users. And so knowing that, being able to provide those options and good information and resources is very much our role, so that they can make those choices on their own. And then, their rights, their right to have their rights protected. So again, when we see that this is not happening at any point of those interventions, not only by our own programs, but by other programs, it is, our job to advocate for them. And, and I say our own programs because I've managed a lot of different programs, and there have been points in time where I've had to look at the very systems and protocols that I had implemented within my own programs, right? And so that introspect, that self-reflection, that humility, to be able to see how we may potentially be blocking some of these rights for survivors is really important. Okay, so, what are some of the, again, sexual assault victim needs? I've listed them out. I'm not going to read them all off, but again, looking at a coordinated response, right, initially, and that's really important. And when we talk a little bit about sexual assault response teams, that's like the key to, it being coordinated and collaborative. I'm a very strong believer that it not only is it our job, but it is imperative that we provide the response and need of the survivor at the time that they need it, right? Otherwise, it's a lost opportunity for that survivor to get what they need, right? And a lot of times that is detrimental to them moving forward with that healing and being able to fulfill those rights. And so again, how do we provide the need when they need it? It's not always possible, but we should be prioritizing to make this happen. And so again, that, like, when do they need that medical care? When do they need that follow-up, right? There are key places where a survivor may need something, and, whether or not we are trained or have the tools to provide it at that moment is really important, right? So, and then, I wanted to kind of just focus, again, I, do a whole different presentation when you're looking at kind of restorative justice and rebalancing and all of that. But again, survivors are telling us that they need different things. And I wanted to kind of just very briefly highlight and acknowledge that the different systems that we work with have different roles, right? And so it is very important for us to understand what those needs and roles and goals of those other systems are, not necessarily so that we can agree with them, right? But one, so that we can continue to advocate for those systems to reflect the needs of survivors, but then also to be able to have that information and be able to advocate the best we can for our survivors, right? So if we fully understand what the needs and goals of the criminal justice system are, then we can better advocate and and support our survivors. If we understand the role of law enforcement, whether it's tribal police, whether it's, sheriff, county, city, all the different law enforcement agencies, if we understand what their roles are, then again, we can better support our survivors. So it's more of, having that information, and then we can also provide better collaboration in terms of working within those roles and the advocacy piece. So again, acknowledging that, the criminal justice system has a very different role than an advocate role, than a community response role. These are some of those for criminal justice system, but again, mostly I just wanted to point out that, having the partnership, having the understanding, and building that collaboration with these other entities, such as law enforcement, such as the criminal justice system, such as child welfare, right? A lot of tribes have ICWA workers, and they work closely with child welfare. I've done so many trainings with CPS and, child welfare in general, Department of Social Services, and, and they don't understand things that are very relevant for Native people, such as ICWA and the historical framework and foundations that is very important when we're looking at, child welfare. So, making those connections and having those spaces and that training is important on both ends. I just wanted to kind of include a little bit about, VAWA and Tribal Law and Order Act, just because, I know 1994 seems like a long time ago, but really it's not that long ago. And, that is when VAWA was passed, and it was the very first legislation to address DV and SA as crimes nationally. Treaties address it and all of this, but again, we have had difficulty in terms of acknowledging that even domestic violence and sexual assault needs to be addressed as a crime. And so VAWA is kind of like that first legislation to really open up the doors to not only criticize the law, right, to criticize VAWA, but then also to lead to the Tribal Law and Order Act, and then also more recently the reauthorization of VAWA. And so in 2005, when that VAWA was reauthorized, that's when we added language about addressing DV and SA in Indian country, right? And then the recent VAWA further adds not only language to addressing it, but funding. So again, looking at some of those policy work that has been done nationally, a lot from Native peoples themselves. Okay, so this slide, it's difficult to read, but you can always pull it up. But just to acknowledge that in California, there are in fact penal codes that formally establish sexual assault response teams within the law. And again, so that is important when we're looking at who can do forensic examinations, who is a sexual assault advocate, and all of those different things. So it is important for advocates and tribes and organizations and so forth to be aware of this, so that we can use that information to not only empower survivors, but also so that we can systematically set up our systems. Okay, so some definitions for those that aren't familiar with this. Again, I mentioned SART being sexual assault response teams. These are multidisciplinary interagency sexual assault models that are comprised of, it can be tribes, public and private agencies, community collaboratives. I work with a community, in the Central Coast area that has peer responders, right? Volunteers that are peer responders working in Indigenous communities. So, this can look very differently, but again, emphasizing the fact that they are multidisciplinary and they are collaborative. Now, for SAFE and SANE, the sexual assault forensic examiner or sexual assault nurse examiner, these are clearly defined professionals that actually can do those forensic examinations, right? VAWA provides the right for a survivor to get these examinations for free. And so these are the people who are able to do that. And again, having that knowledge and awareness of who those people are is important when we're looking at building our teams. So CalCASA, it's the California Sexual Assault Coalition here in California. In my role at the partnership, we work very closely with CalCASA, and they provide a lot of different resources, including building your SART team. They have a manual, they provide technical assistance. I know that they are working with tribes in California, but I also feel that the more that we reach out to them as Native peoples, the more they are also going to be forced to kind of beef up their TA and prioritize working with Native peoples as well, and advocating at the policy level. So, CalCASA is a resource, but also, it is our responsibility to continue to push them so that they prioritize Native people in terms of their agenda as a coalition as well. And so their definition or kind of mission of SARTs is really, again, to just kind of restore the well-being of the victim and to bring, somebody to justice for that person doing harm. But again, that looks very differently. And in that sexual assault response team manual, it acknowledges that, nothing is, one way or the other, that there is a huge gray area that we work within. Okay, so this is a little bit more about collaborations, again, the importance. This slide talks a little bit about SART goals. We talked, about this already, but really, again, just providing support to that survivor, as well as ensuring that they have what they need at the right time. This is the penal code that, defines sexual assault counselors. It defines rape crisis centers. It also provides exclusions. But, when you're looking at who a sexual assault counselor is, it's really important to know this penal code and to know the law so that we can properly explain it to survivors in terms of when they're having communications with program staff, to law enforcement, to everybody, right? There's a piece in that code that identifies and distinguishes what privilege is, and and who can have those privileged conversations with a sexual assault survivor, and what that means with regards to even taking things to court, right? And so that's one penal code to be familiar with as well. Okay, so again, looking at SART teams, again, knowing that there's a lot of gray area and they can look very differently, especially within tribal programs and responding in rural areas. But these are some of the things that are or have been focused on in terms of SART advocates. And again, the huge need to be available 24 hours a day is big, because again, if we're focusing on providing a survivor what they need when they need it, a lot of times that isn't between 8 and 5, right? So having that flexibility to have programs that are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so that response can happen. A lot of times that means having a diverse group of people who can do different schedules or be on call. It's also really important that we have all genders, right? And I don't mean male and female, because we know that there are many genders. And again, I'm not, it doesn't have to be a checkbox like we have this person and this person, but to have some diversity within the genders of advocates. I've personally worked with survivors who have said, I don't want a female advocate, because they may have experienced abuse by someone from that gender, or I don't want a two-spirit advocate, because I am two-spirit and that community is too small. Or I've had, again, a male survivor actually that, had said that, I would like a male survivor because I feel I would connect with them better. So again, there's so much to consider. And so as, on the program end, it's important for us to think about those things that might come up before they actually come up. Okay. Again, these are just some other pieces, like what is the role of the advocate? We talked about providing support and information, but also that's, accompaniment, right? Sometimes that accompaniment means to their medical exam or to their law enforcement interview or court or other appointments, right? Sometimes it means going to, the Department of Health, and Human Services, with them, or anywhere where they might need additional support, because we know going to those places might open up additional trauma or might be traumatic themselves, right? And then, the one I always highlight, of course, is like the follow-up services and, case management afterwards. Like, once they've started that healing process, that's really important, because a lot of times funding isn't focused there. Funding is oftentimes focused on that crisis intervention, which is in fact really important. But there's also a huge dire need for a focus to be on that follow-up, right, and that post-crisis. So things that we don't recommend that advocates do, obviously, is not to translate, not to speak for the survivor, whether so translate either whether there's a language barrier, or if there's a survivor is struggling with getting their point across, whatever. We don't want to speak for them. We need to find ways that might be more helpful. And I've actually had a survivor write out things before during an interview, right? Or pre-record things, right? And it's gonna be different depending on what organization or what law enforcement agency or whatever is you're working with and what they will allow you to do. But again, trying to be creative so to make sure that they are speaking their voice and you're not doing that. And again, you can't partake in that interview necessarily by impeding or interrupting or adding your input or the evidentiary exam. I added the kind of, remember your boundaries. As a Native woman working in Native communities, this is very important, right? And, for those of us who work with our own communities or those that work with small communities, a lot of times boundaries can be very translucent. So it is much easier to uphold a boundary than to actually try to impose a boundary after something has happened. So I just remind people that it's important to remember boundaries from the beginning, at the same time acknowledging that to be culturally responsive, sometimes our policies and procedures need to reflect the cultural pieces of that community. So for example, food is really important in our communities, and, gifting, right? And so I work for an organization right now where we have a gift acceptance policy, as long as it's not a certain amount or things like that, so that we can explain to someone who is giving us a gift, we acknowledge that this is something, cultural, that we acknowledge that, we want to accept it, it just can't be over this much, and this is why. And so having those conversations and being very transparent is important. This is the Tribal Law and Policy Institute's Start in Tribal Communities workbook or handbook, and I like it a lot. So it's from several years ago, but it's very relevant, especially with working with tribal communities. So again, the link will be in the slide deck, so you can access it later as a tool. So some of the challenges, of course, developing a SART, these are some of them. I'm sure they're not new to you, but, to keep in mind, and that way we can kind of work through them. And also, it's important to share SART stories with each other so that we don't have to make the same mistakes, right? We can learn from everybody else's fabulous flops, so we don't have to repeat them. I was going to show this video clip, but just given the fact that we've had some link opening issues, as well as, I want to be respectful of time, I'm not going to show it, but it focused kind of on a program that is working to reduce stigma and shame within their community. And they have a volunteer SART program, and it just talks briefly for a couple of minutes about what they're doing. And so the link will be in the materials when you get that follow-up email. I'm not going to go over this slide just because, again, looking at the benefits, we talked a little bit about it, and you'll have the slide to read. But I just wanted to end on looking and focusing on resiliency, because as Native people, we very much have a lot of resiliency. A lot of the models, even SART in itself as being collaborative and all of that, that is very much embedded in our Native epistemologies, in our Native ways. And so I want to acknowledge that, that resilience and those protective factors that lead to healing and overcoming a lot of this adversity is very much traditional. So I encourage programs to implement programs that focus on culture as prevention, culture as healing, that focus on language, restoration, that focus on restorative justice, and all of those different things. And I know programs and tribes in California are doing a lot of that work. So if any of you have questions or want to be connected to any of those tribes or communities or organizations that are doing some of that, you're welcome to reach out to me afterwards. But I wanted to kind of end here. The next slide is, just some resources. Of course, there are many, but I've been told that the shorter initially, at least, is preferred. And then, of course, if you need something very specific or want more, just reach out to me. That's my email on the slide. And now that's time for questions. Again, I want to be respectful of your time. So Linda is going to let me know if there are questions already in the Q&A or as they appear.
I don't see any questions right now in the Q&A section, but I am going to unmute everyone if they would like to ask a question. Let me see.
Perfect.
And I can't do that. Joy, are you on the line? Do you know how to unmute?
I'm on. I'm unmuting everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I have everybody unmuted. Does anybody have a question for Cibonay?
Can you hear me? My name is Veronica.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I have a question. Cibonay, I missed the first part of your presentation, but I was just curious how you got into it personally, what it was that brought you to this line of work.
What got me? Yeah, so in the beginning of my presentation, I talked briefly about kind of like who I am and my experience. And, to be quite transparent and honest, like I am a sexual assault survivor. And I am also a domestic violence survivor, right? And so I actually started doing this work in high school. And just as a result of not getting the treatment and healing that I needed when I needed it. When I was 12, I was molested. And then a couple of years later, I was assaulted in junior high school and again in high school. And so as a Native young person, it was very difficult for me working with like Kaiser, a therapist at Kaiser, working with, the medical examination team and all of that. And it really added additional trauma to my own experience. And later in life as a young adult, had to kind of figure that out, right? And so it kind of led me to really work and research in graduate school. My focus was on tribal communities and looking at trauma as well as healing. And so a lot of the passion and work is so that it can be better for other Native people, as well as I've worked for mainstream organizations and looking at how our people have been inadequately serviced and unserviced, period. And so kind of trying to make some change for that has been initially why I wanted to work in these fields. And then, of course, looking at the intersectionality between, a lot of the other symptoms that we see has kind of led my work in other areas and other fields. So, again, I acknowledge that. And I know that sometimes I've had to take steps out of direct service, you know, so that I can take care and balance myself and make sure that I am able to do this work. And which is why, you know, sometimes like right now I do less direct service work as a consultant and a staff person at the partnership. But, you know, I try to go back and forth into direct services because I do enjoy that work too.
Thank you. That was my other part, was how do you take care of yourself? So that you answered that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Cibonay, there's a question that Scott just put in. It says, is there any data that looks at the rates of survivors and suicide rates? Specifically, has the changes and increase in advocacy and response teams that are being formed impacted those stats?
So actually, yes, there is some, and if you email me, I can kind of send you some of those in email, but there is some data that shows a correlation between suicide and, you know, sexual violence, specifically for Native communities, as well as the larger communities within this country. There are some reports that have come out. Again, you know, whenever you're looking at data, you know, keeping in mind that there are disparities within data itself and some challenges, but a lot of the suicide prevention and suicide intervention work, you know, there's a lot of cross-training going on as a result of some of those reports, you know, intricately making connections between those two fields, and looking at, you know, what rates show in terms of for those who have experienced sexual violence, are then the statistics show that, you know, whether or not suicide has been attempted, right, or suicide has been something that has been reported. So yeah, I can email me and I can send you some of those over. Okay, I don't know if Joy, did anything else come through? I can't see the.
Yeah, no, he just said perfect, thank you. So expect an email from Scott. And maybe anybody else that wants that information. What we can do, go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, feel free to, you know, reach out to me. I know that a lot of times I even personally will have questions after, you know, the webinar is over. So don't feel that you can't ask a question later.
Okay, what we're going to do really quick is what we did last time, and we're going to go stop the recording for a minute. So if anybody has a question that they don't want to have recorded, that it can just be answered. So give me 1 second.